For those who probably don't live in the UK, Eastenders is a very popular British television soap opera created by Julia Smith and Tony Holland, which has been broadcast on BBC One since February 1985 and never stopped since then. Set in the fictional borough of Walford in the East End of London, the programme follows the stories of local residents and their families as they go about their daily lives. Within 8 months of the show's original launch, it had reached the #1 spot in UK's television ratings. The biggest storylines of the show are the local pub brawls and power couples cheating on each other. It also brings awareness to social problems and many issues that are considered taboo in our society that no other show in the UK would even dare to broadcast. This is why Eastenders is so popular. The show has a big diversity of characters, but main long-standing character is Phil Mitchell. Philip Mitchell is a resident of Albert Square and Eastenders' main character. He is the eldest son of Eric and Peggy Mitchell, the older brother of Grant and Sam Mitchell, and the father of Ben and Louise Mitchell. Phil Mitchell is the local hard man that everyone respects and fears. Phil has been married 5 times to Nadia Borovac in 1993, Kathy Beale in 1995, Kate Morton in 2003, Sharon Watts in 2014, and Kat Slater in 2023. Phil has a tough persona and has often resorted to violence. Despite this, however, his family is important to him, particularly his relationships with his cousin Billy, younger brother Grant, and mother Peggy. Originally portrayed as the nicer of 2 thugs alongside Grant, Phil developed a nastier side when Grant left in 1999 after betraying his older brother. Phil has committed almost every crime thinkable in the show and has developed a reputation as the local villain, but his softer side does still emerge from time to time. Phil and his brother Grant moved to Walford in February 1990 to open an automobile repair shop known as the Archers. Phil was originally the calmer brother, as Grant was more the hot-headed one in their early days, but both brothers had a sense of physical danger, displaying stereotypical masculinity, thuggish behaviour, and a tendency to resolve problems through violence, and began to be the local hardman on Albert Square. Phil was originally the one who often thought things through and was seen to be the more streetwise of the two, often bailing his more spontaneous brother out of trouble. However, by the late 1990s to early 2000s, Phil was driven down a darker, more destructive route. Over the years, Phil has somewhat built an empire from being just a dodgy criminal to a full-time gangster. Phil has committed many crimes such as countless assaults, robberies, money laundering, manslaughter, and attempted murders. Phil has had numerous feuds with residents with the likes of Mark and Martin Fowler, Ian Beale, Dan Sullivan, Dennis Rickman, Den Watts, Johnny Allen, Patrick Truman Derrick, Jack and Max Branning, and most notably of all, Steve Owen. There are so many characters in the show that have a personal vendetta against Phil Mitchell, but somehow, someway, he always finds a way to get out of trouble. He has also had many near-death experiences, such as crashing into the River Thames with his brother Grant in 1999 and being shot by his ex-girlfriend Lisa Shaw in 2001. Phil set the Queen Victoria pub on fire in 2010 after believing his mother Peggy loved the pub more than her own son. In the 1990s, Phil became an alcoholic. Staying sober was a constant battle for Phil, and one he didn't always win, with him falling off the wagon several times over the following years. Philip James Mitchell was born on the 20th of January 1961, the eldest child of Eric Mitchell and Peggy Mitchell. Eric Mitchell was a very talented boxer when he was younger, and he's always reliving his boxing years and showing off his trophies and achievements of his boxing accolades. Phil's brother, Grant Mitchell, was born on the 8th of July 1962. Phil and Grant were very close, especially when they were kids. Phil was abused a lot by his alcoholic father, Eric, who rarely touched Grant. This led Phil to be hurt that he was singled out for abuse by his dad. Phil and Grant could be wayward and often got into scrapes. At school, they became best friends with Nigel Bates, who the Mitchells saw as a brother to them. Nigel was naive, so the Mitchell brothers sorted out anyone who tried to pick on Nigel. One time when Phil was young, during the middle of the night, Phil was asleep. His father came stumbling into Phil's bedroom and he punched Phil in the stomach without a reason. Phil used to go to school scared stiff that teachers would see the bruises. Peggy considered leaving when Phil and Grant were teenagers, and once even tried to seduce Johnny Allen, but he turned her down. Peggy tried to save her marriage by having another child, and in 1975, her only daughter Sam. Eric stopped abusing Phil when Phil eventually hit him back, knocking him out cold. Peggy called the police on Eric for his abuse and he was arrested. Phil was always the calmer Mitchell brother, but both had thuggish tendencies. In the late 1970s, Grant joined the army. Phil worked on the lorries for a time where he met Minty Peterson. Phil Mitchell first arrived in Walford to open an automobile repair shop known as the Archers. Just feet away, Rod Norman and Harry Osborne were sitting in the square gardens. They had seen Phil zip into the square in his car. 29-year-old Phil made his first appearance in Albert Square buying the mechanics, the Archies. Him and Grant have a brief fling with Julie Cooper. Phil goes into a partnership with the Queen Victoria Public House along with his younger brother Grant Mitchell and Grant's fiancée Sharon Watts, but they buy the upstairs house above it. Phil and Grant had a reputation for being a bit dodgy. Grant had a thuggish side, and even Phil showed thuggish tendencies, but usually was more level-headed. He often kept Grant in check. Grant was very popular with the ladies. In the early 90s, he started a relationship with Sharon Watts and got married a few years later. In 1992, Grant became increasingly moody and unsupportive of his new wife, Sharon. Phil comforted her and one time slept with her, something he regretted. Following a breakup from lover Anne Howes, Phil and Sharon grow closer. Sharon would usually turn to him when she and Grant had a row or Grant gained physical violence. They sleep together, but she chooses to stay with Grant. Grant ended up in jail, and in his absence, he and Sharon reconcile their affair. But when Grant is released from prison as a reformed man, she decides to reconcile with him and she leaves a broken-hearted Phil. Meanwhile, Phil meets a Romanian refugee, Nadia Borovac, who wants to stay in the UK. To avoid deportation, he had entered a marriage of convenience with her in July 1993, but Nadia departs after the ceremony. Phil later falls in love with businesswoman Kathy Beale. Nadia returns and makes his life hell. She seduced Phil, which he denied. Phil had wanted to marry Kathy that year, but in order to do that, he needs a divorce from Nadia. Nadia would only agree to divorce if Phil paid her £1,000 in order to move to Germany. He gave her the money, and she was never seen again. In early 1994, Phil bought a flat for a pittance off Frank Butcher. He also bought Frank's share of the cafe for a knockdown price for his new girlfriend, Kathy Beale. Phil returned the favor by torching cash strapped to Frank's car lot so Frank could claim on the insurance. By accident, a vagrant died in the fire. The police interrogated Phil and Frank but could get no evidence. Phil told Frank to hold it together. One wrong word and they could be arrested and serve a prison sentence for a long time. Frank later legged it after the insurance man saw his business accounts, which would have shown Frank was broke and the fire was arson. Phil married Kathy in 1995 and she was soon pregnant, but in late 1995, after almost 2 years away, Frank returned to Albert Square, having been released from a psychiatric hospital. This caused Phil to start drinking again, worried that Frank would go to the police over the car lot scam. Kathy and Phil eventually sort out their differences and get married. Kathy gives birth to Ben. Phil feels neglected and depressed, so turns to alcohol, developing an addiction. He becomes neglectful of Ben, so Kathy leaves him. Realizing what he has lost, Phil gives up drinking to rebuild his marriage. He attends Alcoholics Anonymous, which helps reveal the basis of his problem, the physical abuse he received from his father and his fear he will do the same to Ben. Kathy takes him back, but when he attends counseling, he begins an affair with a fellow alcoholic named Lorna Cartwright. Fast forward to year 2000, he starts seeing Lisa Shaw, but the relationship stalls when Kathy returns briefly, continuing an affair with Grant. However, before she is due to return to South Africa, she asks Phil to leave with her. Phil cannot go as Grant has planned an armed robbery, and Phil will not let his brother do the job alone. Infuriated with Phil's loyalty to Grant, Kathy reveals their recent tryst, leading to Phil confronting Grant after the heist, and Grant confessing that he slept with Kathy to get revenge on Phil for sleeping with his love interest Sharon Watts. While trying to escape the police in a getaway car, Phil pulls out a handgun and shoots at the dashboard, which causes Grant to crash into the River Thames. Phil is rescued, but Grant's body is not recovered, though he survives and flees to Brazil. In 2003, Phil falls for Kate Morton, not knowing she is an undercover police officer investigating Lisa's disappearance. After gaining a confession from Phil that he manipulated Lisa into handing over Louise, Kate reveals her true identity and says she loves him and will quit her job, but Phil threatens to kill her. Kate disappears, but several months later, Phil finds her while she is working undercover for the Square's gangland boss, Jack Dalton. In June 2010, it was reported that Phil would develop an addiction to crack cocaine after his troubled personal life leads to depression. The report followed the news that actress Lucy Benjamin was to return for a single episode, reprising her role as Lisa, the mother of Phil's daughter Louise. In the storyline, Phil gains custody of Louise after she is dropped off in Walford by an unseen person. However, Peggy, Phil Mitchell's mother, eventually returns Louise to Lisa after Phil punches his mother in the face. Let's talk about how Phil Mitchell's persona has changed over the years. Phil Mitchell's character changed a lot, especially in the early 2000s. Around this time, we see a more menacing side to his personality. After discovering that his brother Grant had vengefully slept with his wife Kathy, he went ballistic. Among the many issues, Phil Mitchell became an alcoholic. Alcohol abuse and domestic violence culminated in slow deterioration of his love life and friendships. Phil Mitchell is definitely the most popular character in Eastenders. Phil had a lot of sworn enemies over the years, but he always had a way of defeating them, mostly with his thuggish ways holding a baseball bat or just throwing punches at them. Hope you enjoyed our History of Phil Mitchell video. Massive shout out to my subscribers and friends, Freddie Chavez and Rich Franklin, for giving me the idea to do this. Thanks for watching. See you next time.